All right. I think we're live. If anyone can hear me, can you please let me know in the chat? I'll also type it in here. All right, great. Thank you. Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to our second live streamed uh, workshop on mixing and mastering. So, uh, to recap, before we actually had two mixing workshops, one of which was in real life, and then coronavirus happened, and we did the second one live streamed. And now we're going to do a mastering workshop, which we only just decided actually a couple of days ago, I think. So this is going to be a little bit thrown together. So forgive me if it's not as professional as the second streaming workshop, because this was a lot more, a lot quicker. So the what we're going to do today. Actually, I should talk about push buttons first. So Push Buttons is a grassroots DIY initiative. We basically are making accessible educational musical content for people who don't have access. So people who might be lower class, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities, people of LGBTI status, just anyone who has structural barriers that prevent them from being able to access like music education, because it's often kind of like dominated by people who have money and people who are more capable to like conduct themselves in a late capitalist society, so to speak. So that's what we're doing, and that's what this is about. Of course, it's open to everyone, but those are the people that we prioritize. And these streams are obviously, not closed to anyone. Like, it's not like you can't watch this. So we're going to be doing mastering today. So just a quick rundown of what mastering actually is. I've written down a couple of notes that might be good to look at here. So what is mastering and why is it needed? So mastering is the final stage of the creative process. So if we want to talk about what the creative process for producing a piece of music for release is, we would say that it starts with the band writing and arranging their music. Uh, or it might be not a band, but it might be a solo musician or a producer or whatever it is. They would go into a recording studio and they would probably do a demo of the release first. So they would probably be piecing it together in a recording environment to see how it all translates. Then once they've done that, they would probably reach out to a producer and a recording engineer that they particularly like and think that they would work well together. And this is the next stage of the creative process. So I really want to emphasize that it's a creative process. And even up until this point of mastering, it's a creative process. So the producer will be working with the band to realize the creative aspirations of that project, of that album or whatever it is that they're making. And the engineer will be responsible for making sure that everything works and putting the microphones in the right places, making sure that all the machinery works, blah, blah, blah. Once that's done, it goes to a mixing engineer who is also part of the creative process. The mixing engineer is trying to actualize the vision of the band and the producer in the realm of mixing the song. So making sure that all the levels are right, all the tones of every instrument are the way that they should be. Once they've mixed everything, they send that to the mastering engineer. And the mastering engineer is the final stage of the creative process. It's still part of the creative process. However, it's often, it's kind of like, it gets a bit confusing because mastering is actually very technical. There's a lot of, I would say, like, like technical stipulations that you have to adhere to that are kind of like normalized across like all geographies. And that's basically like what mastering engineers are focusing on. So, for example, uh, like like what's the final frequency balance, like the EQ balance of the overall thing? How much dynamic range does it have? Like how much compression are they using? Things like that. So they're using like signal processing like plugins and or like hardware units, and they are basically applying some processing to the final mix to get it to be at a certain level and a certain balance so that it's going to translate accurately according to the vision of the producer and the band onto whatever medium is chosen. So that's the process. The mastering engineer is like the bridge between the production of the music itself into the physical production, into like CDs, vinyls, cassette tapes, or streaming digital releases. So today we're actually going to talk about all of those different platforms and the different kinds of processing that we will need to go through. And because we're trying to like keep this to like 1 hour, so we're just gonna kind of like do one single. It's just gonna be a single song. It's not gonna be like a full album because a full album would take several hours to do. So we're just gonna do a single song. And the song is called Air by Chelsea Wolfe. So due to coronavirus, a bunch of cool acts just released a bunch of their raw, unprocessed stems, and I've basically just downloaded that, and we're just going to use just this one song to master with. So it's going to be our example. So, are there any questions before we move on? If there are, please feel free to type your questions in the chat. Okay. There's also a slight latency. There's a bit of a lag between the stream and the chat. I think it's like 30 seconds or 1 minute, so I'm not going to wait too long. I'm just going to keep going, and any questions that pop up, I'm just going to periodically bring up this pop-up chat so I can see what everyone's saying. Okay, so the first thing we would do if we were listening to a mix before it's mastered is look at the actual waveform and make sure that it's got enough headroom. So I'm using the program Reaper. It doesn't actually matter what program you use. They all do virtually the exact same thing. I'm using Reaper because it's accessible, it's affordable. You can evaluate it for a long period of time before you buy it. And when you do buy it, I bought it in Australia, and I think I paid 60 Australian dollars for it, which is really not much for this kind of a program. But even still, there's other programs you can use. And whatever you're used to working with, just use that. Because it's workflow is important, and actually it's better to just stick to what you already know as long as it's working for you, than have to go and like learn like a brand new digital audio workstation like Pro Tools or whatever when it's not actually doing anything functionally different to what you're already using. So I'm using Reaper. You can use Logic, you can use Ableton, even whatever you want to do. Okay, so headroom is a word that I just used. Headroom is the difference between the loudest peak and the digital ceiling of what your audio workstation is capable of reproducing. So we want to have at least 6 decibels here. So what I'm going to do is actually come up here, and to demonstrate it, I've just basically put the cursor here so I can start playing from there. I'm going to go over here, and where my cursor is now, I'm going to press play, and we're going to look at what the meter reading here is. Okay. We can see we've got negative 8.8 on the left channel, negative 9.5 on the right channel. So just to quickly give you an idea of what these figures mean, this is a metering scale called dBFS. That's decibels full scale. That's how we measure. It's one of the ways that we measure digital signal. So the loudest that sound can be reproduced is at 0 decibels in dBFS. The quietest is negative infinity. So negative infinity is silence, and 0 decibels is that's like the limit. That's the head. That's when if you go past that, you're clipping. It's going to be actually compromising the integrity of the signal that you're putting into it. Okay, so we've seen that it's got at least 6 decibels. The reason why we want to do that is so that we have enough headroom to apply our signal processing to this final mix. And so the first thing I'm going to do is, I think we'll start with a streaming master, because this is going to give us all of the different processing tools that we need before going on to some more complicated ones. So streaming is actually probably the most simple, because it's not as loaded as mastering for CD, because CDs became popular during a time when there wasn't a standardized level of measuring what's an appropriate volume for a musical release for broadcast on radio, for example. So what ended up happening was something called the loudness wars, where every CD that was released by a major label was getting louder and louder and louder, but you can't really make something louder when you're working in digital. So they're actually compressing it further and further and further and compromising the integrity of the signal to the point of distortion, and it was hideous. So it's a bit of a loaded medium. So we're going to start with streaming, because actually streaming is it's not perfect, but it's in terms of the signal processing that we apply to it, it's the most hands-off you can possibly be. Okay, so what's the first thing we're going to do? We're going to look at compression. So if anyone that's listening, if you don't know what compression is, please send a comment in the chat, and I can quickly explain it. Any specific questions you have about any of this stuff, you can ask me, but I'll just briefly explain what we're doing. So we're going to be using a compressor as a tool to diminish the dynamic range of the final master. Okay, so this is going to be something that's taking this content and all of these louder parts, we're going to be kind of like turning them down, so to speak. Okay, so let's actually go to the loudest part of the song. Actually, no, you know what? Before that, why don't we have a listen to the entire song and see what it sounds like? Because this is what you would actually do if you were mastering. You would listen to the entire track. Keeping in mind what's happening, listening to potential problems, and also considering what kind of processing you need to apply to it. So let's go. All right. Great. Cool. So we listened to the entire track, and what I was hearing was that it's quite a muddy mix. However, you have to keep in mind that like if you're mastering a song, you have to be part of the creative process, and you have to take into account what the what's the artist actually wanting to do. What's the context in which they're creating? Listen to the genre that they are producing in. Like Chelsea Wolfe, she's part of the whole kind of occult, stoner rock, stoner metal, these kinds of genres. She's quite prolific in those kinds of circles. And if you listen to those albums, they are quite muddy. They're difficult to discern. And I think that that's part of the philosophy of her music because, the whole point of the occult is that it's hidden, right? And so she's obscuring certain elements to give it a sense of mystery and depth. And so this is something that we actually need to keep in mind so that we're not imparting our own judgment on her music and therefore distorting her message through our own lens. So that's why we're part of the creative process, basically. That's something I really want to state because it's something that's actually often forgotten about in mastering by mastering engineers that are less experienced, I think. And so there were different parts of the song. So at the beginning, there was it started with just a vocal loop. It went into some guitars. Eventually, very subtle drumming came in. And then after that, around here is when the stronger drumming comes in. And there were a few issues that I heard. So before I go on, I want to answer Chemlia, I think. Maybe I'm not pronouncing your name right, so apologies if I don't pronounce your name right. So normally when we record, there are as many tracks and more for each instrument. How do we end up with one track for mastering, not only record, but also after mixing? So great question. Okay, so when you're recording and mixing something, you're working with a multi-track session. And multi-track means that there's multiple tracks. When you finish your mix, you render it, or it might be called export or bounce. There's a bunch of different names that mean the exact same thing. But basically, it means that you're converting all of that into only what your master channel is hearing. So you're converting your multi-track into a stereo master track mix, right? So it's just whatever the master bus is hearing. So that's what we've got here. So I did a quick mix of this track last night to get it ready for this session, and she'd already done some summing, and there was only about 7 tracks, but she probably had about, maybe 100 different tracks in her multi-track, which she's then summed to 7, which is probably what the mixing engineer was, mostly working with, those 7 different tracks to mix everything. And then I mixed, I did some tweaks to that and then rendered it using the exact same sample rate and bit depth as it was recorded and mixed in. So sample rate and bit depth is important. This one is in 48 kilohertz for the sample rate. For the record, CDs are 44.1 kilohertz sample rate. And this recording is also 24-bit for its bit depth. And for reference, a CD is 16-bit. So this is basically recorded at a higher fidelity than a CD. And that's purely because of, if you have more information in your computer when you're mixing it, it has more, it can process things better. 48 kilohertz 24-bit is, in my opinion, the ideal for recording and mixing. And when you master it, we actually change that to whatever the medium needs. So in the case of CD, we're actually going to convert this to 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit. And we'll talk about that whole process towards the end, because this is there's a little bit more that we have to do for CD as well. So I hope that answers your question. Marty is saying, usually during mixing you also put compression, etc. on the master track, right? Yes, you do. So what's the difference between that and mastering? Maybe I'm mixing things up. No, you are not. So in mixing, often you'll have a master bus processing chain. So you'll have maybe you'll have an EQ. You might even have a compressor. A lot of the time, professional engineers will have hardware units, and their master bus signal chain will be something like compression, EQ, and then it goes back into the mix bus. So the compression and EQ are inserted into the mix bus channel strip. They're basically just affecting the master bus in the mix. So the difference is who is doing it and for what purpose they're doing it. The mixing engineer is applying that processing because they believe that it sounds good for the mix. And that is part of their creative decision. For mastering engineers, we're doing things a little bit more technically. So if we are applying compression, it's because there wasn't enough compression applied before. If we're applying equalization, it's because the mix, for whatever reason, needs to be the balance needs to be changed for the medium that it's going to be represented on. So mixing engineer is purely doing what sounds great through their speakers, and mastering engineer has the consideration of the final medium, whether it's streaming, CD, cassette, vinyl, whatever. So I hope that answers your question. So I think it is confusing because it's the same kind of processing. It's the same type of processing, but it's the frame of mind and its purpose is what changes. So, okay, so what's the first thing we should do now? We should set a compressor, because I actually heard that there were some things that were popping out to me a little bit too much. And there are also a few things that I found were a bit harsh in certain areas. But this is where it's actually going to get a little bit complicated because it's such a dynamic song. Like, for example, back here, it's much quieter. Up here, it's much louder. And that's part of the strength of the song. So we need to keep that dynamic in mind so that we don't compromise that too much, So we should be enhancing the sound, basically. So since we're applying compression, it's dynamics processing. We're going to be changing the dynamic range of this track. So we're going to go to the loudest part of the track and see see how the compressor is going to react there. Okay, so I've already loaded up a compressor. I'm going to turn it on because that was turned off just a minute ago. And I'm using FabFilter Pro C2. If you're having money troubles at the moment, don't worry too much. I mean, all of this stuff is very expensive, obviously, and you do, get what you pay for. Like, it sounds very good. It does its job very, very well. But just for your information, like anything that's ever digitally distributed online, any digital product that's distributed online, you can find it, for free in, if you know where to look. And I mean, I don't advocate for anything criminal, obviously, for any authorities that might be listening. But yeah, if you were to go onto a website like 1377x.to and find whatever you want, that's up to you. But I'm not saying you should do that. So yeah, okay. So FabFilter Pro C2, that's the one I'm going to be using. So the important thing to note is that different compressors have different applications. When we're working with something as complex as a mixed, like a rendered mix, we're dealing with something that has a lot of harmonic information. So it's not just a vocal, it's not just a kick drum, it's not just a guitar, it's everything. It's got so much information that if you put the wrong kind of a compressor on it, it's going to start freaking out. It's not going to know how to respond to it. So we need to choose the right kind. So FabFilter Pro C2 has a bunch of different types in it. Clean, classic, opto, blah, blah, blah. We're going to go to mastering. This is a compressor algorithm that is specifically designed for dealing with harmonically complex and dynamically complex material, so that it doesn't impart too many obvious alterations to the signal, but it still does its job. It still compresses it, right? So if you, for example, put something really aggressive on it, like pumping, right? That's designed for like really aggressive compression styles. That's going to sound terrible on this. This is going to sound like it's just like a mushy mess. You're not going to hear any intricacies. So I've put my cursor to the most complex part of the song, and we're going to listen to it and apply some compression. So if people don't know how to use compressors, just like ask me. I'm going to go ahead and assume that there's some basic knowledge, and I'm going to just give basic ideas of what I'm doing as I'm going as well. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so we've got the threshold set here. So we can see that the signal is going past the threshold. We're seeing here it's compressing, and this meter here is telling us it's compressing by 6.3 decibels. So it's turning it down. We've got 4:1 ratio. I'm going to actually pull that down to about 2:1. This release for me is a little bit too... The release is a little bit too long. I'm hearing it as soon as it's clamping down on the compressor. It's clamping down really quickly, and I'm actually not hearing the attack of the drums as strongly as I would like to. And then it's not releasing quick enough before the next drumming is coming in. Because as you can hear, the drumming is actually quite fast. And we need the release time to be fast enough to recover before the next drum hit. Otherwise, it's going to sound like it's just moving too much. It's like pumping too much. Okay, so let's turn this down. I'm going to slow down the attack. Cool. Okay, so now we're hearing something more close to what I would like to hear. So if you want to have a listen to it, pay attention to what's happening at the start of each drum hit, and have a listen to how the drums and the vocals are interacting with one another. Because if sometimes a drum hits and the vocal sounds like it goes quiet, that's going to be a problem, because we don't want it to sound like an effect. We don't want it to be discernible to the listener. We want to represent what is what the artist and the mixing engineer and the producer were intending. So let's have a listen to it again and just pay attention to all of these interactions of all these different elements. Cool. So there are some places where actually there's a huge amount of compression happening, but that's actually not from this compressor. It's from the mix bus compressor that was applied by the not the mix bus. I mean the individual compressors that are applied to the bus tracks by the mixing engineer before us. So this isn't completely unprocessed. You can hear that there's actually quite a lot of processing that's already been applied to it. But yeah, that's something that we can't actually do away with. So it's already been printed to the track, and we're just kind of trying to balance between different elements here. So yeah, I'm liking what I'm hearing. So let's actually try a different compression style that's going to be way too aggressive and not work at all for this. Okay, let's have a listen to this. I've just changed a bunch of parameters to something that I know is not going to work. So this is absolutely the wrong settings for what we're doing. You can barely hear the drums. The drums don't hit, you know? That's because the attack is set to 0.005 milliseconds, which is something that actually I don't know if any hardware compressor is capable of reproducing. That's like such a fast attack time that's just like absolutely mind-blowing. So every time a drum hits, you don't hear the stick hitting the skin because that is already destroyed by the attack of the compressor. And then we have the release set to way too slow. 362.3 milliseconds is way too slow for the speed of the drumming in this song. And what we're hearing is that the drums have almost completely vanished. And the vocals are very upfront, but they're lacking in life. Like, it doesn't sound good at all. So let's go back to what we had before. So a 2-to-1 ratio, we had the mastering style. I had about 30 milliseconds and I had about 50 milliseconds here. And the threshold, I think I was setting it to just enough to have like 3 decibels of gain reduction or something like that. So I'm just going to click here so we get it back to normal. Yeah, that's about it. Cool. So we've set the most important parts of this compressor. However, since we're mastering, we need to be thinking about transparency overall, okay? So let me just see if there's any questions so far. No, okay. So transparency is a word that I like to use for this because like we want it to sound like we're not affecting anything at all. We just want it to sound better. We don't want it to like sound like, you know, I can hear that it was this mastering engineer that worked on this. Like you want to like erase yourself completely from this, you know, like it sounds like very anti-ego, but like that's kind of what you have to do because like the point is like that the artist is trying to say something to their audience and like we're the ones that are supposed to help them, you know. So so transparency is the key. So keeping that in mind, this next part of this compression process is integral for mastering. And this is where it's different a little bit from mixing. This is something you wouldn't normally do when you're mixing. You might, but like it's not that common. So I'm opening up this tab here in this compressor, sidechain. Okay, so the sidechain of a compression unit is basically what is the compressor reacting to? So normally, a compressor is reacting to the sound that's going into it, and then it's applying processing to that same sound, and then putting that processed sound out. The sidechain of a compressor is something that you can use to either change the signal that it's responding to, or put in a completely different signal for it to respond to. So you can, for example, put in, like, in mixing, sometimes you use the sidechain of a compressor to put like a compressor on a bass guitar, where the sidechain is listening to the kick drum instead of to the bass guitar, even though it's on the bass guitar track. It's listening to the kick drum and applying compression to the bass track according to information it gets from the kick track. The effect being, every time a kick drum hits, the bass guitar turns down according to the ratio, threshold, attack, and release set by the compressor. So here we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're not going to be putting an external input into the sidechain. We're going to change the frequency response of the song itself as how the sidechain hears it. So this isn't going to affect the sound of the output. It's only going to affect the sound that the sidechain itself is hearing. So here I'm actually putting in EQ. So this part of the sidechain is an EQ that's applying itself to whatever the sidechain has going into it. In this case, it's the default, which is this audio track is going straight into the sidechain. And what I've done here is at 100 Hertz, I've got a high pass filter, which means that the compressor is no longer going to be responding to any content underneath 100 Hertz. So it's not responding to the bass instrument, the bass synth isn't in it anymore. The low frequencies of the drums are no longer going to be something that triggers the compressor to compress. And what's going to happen is, effectively, it's only going to be compressing the higher frequencies. I mean, it's only going to be listening to the higher frequencies and only compressing according to when the high frequencies are jumping in. Why am I doing that? Because, as you probably have noticed, there's a lot of high frequency content, especially in the vocals. So everything in this mix is very dark. But then as soon as the singer comes in, there's like this really bright whisper, like that's kind of like playing along. It's like she sings so breathy that's like quite a prominent element of her voice. It's really beautiful. But we don't want to have a kick drum attenuating, the vocals, for example. We want the vocals to stay up front and the compressor to only respond to when the vocals are going too strong, right? So that's why we've got this in place. Let's see if there's any questions. Cool. All right, let's have a listen to that. Now you can see down here, this more transparent gray is what it used to be. And this is now what the sidechain processing has done to it. It's turned down the bass so that the compressor is no longer reacting to the bass. And instead, it's only reacting to the rest of the frequency content. And then the output is what it's applying to the full spectrum. So the sidechain is only what the compressor hears. We don't hear the sidechain processing. It's only what the compressor itself hears and what the compressor reacts to. And the compressor reacts upon that information and imparts it upon the unprocessed signal without all of this EQing and stuff like that, right? So that's one thing we've done. So we've taken the bass instruments out of the compressor, so it's no longer freaking out every time that there's like a kick drum or a bass guitar that's like slightly too loud for it. It's no longer like jumping down and like clamping down on the vocals when the kick drum's too loud, for example. So that's one thing we had to do. The next thing we have to do is actually this control here is called stereo link. And at the moment it's 100% stereo linked. So if something is too loud on the left channel, it's going to apply compression to the entire stereo field. It's not going to apply compression only to the left channel. So that's a problem in mastering, because sometimes you have something that's popping out too much in one channel and not in the other channel. And so you want it to apply compression according to like where it actually is, right, in the stereo field. So if we take this stereo link and turn it down to 0%, now it's effectively two different compressors, one for each speaker, one for the left speaker, one for the right speaker. So when the left channel is too loud, it turns down the left channel. When the right channel is too loud, it turns down the right channel. That way, you don't get too much compromise when something jumps up on one side as opposed to another. So let's have a listen to what that's done now. So this sounds really exciting to me now because I'm hearing a lot more clarity and detail on each side. If you're not hearing it so much, it might be that your ears aren't tuned to it yet. The more you do this kind of work, the more your ears start becoming accustomed to hearing these kinds of differences, hearing the difference between attack and release times, hearing the difference between when a compressor is reacting to low frequencies as opposed to not, when it's needing to be unlinked in the stereo field, which I always unlink compression in mastering, and you'd find actually, I think virtually, I don't think I've ever heard a single master that hasn't been stereo unlinked for the left and right channel. So yeah. Basically, if you're not hearing it so much, don't worry about it. Just keep trying this stuff, and if you follow the logic of what I'm talking about, you'll be fine. I think most of what I'm trying to do is like get people thinking in the right way, because once you start thinking and listening in the right way, then you can apply your processing in a learned, logical, rational way for the results that you're wanting to have and for what the artist is wanting to represent. Okay, so that's compression done. We might come back and revisit it a little bit later. So this is broadband compression. That's what just normal compression is called. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is go into EQ. But if there's anything that anyone wants to ask about compression, please ask me now. And if not, I'm going to go on to EQ. So I'm going to open up FabFilter Pro Q3. So this is all stuff that you can find in the FabFilter bundle, which is expensive unless you know where to look. Right. So I don't think there's anything being asked. So let's have a listen to the beginning of the track, because now we have to actually apply equalization to the entire mix. Oops. I'm gonna go from the beginning. So it's very dark at this point. Cool. We can hear that there's a bass synth, there's an acoustic guitar, and then there's some atmospheric effects. Okay, and now here's where the problems come in. Listen to the sibilance. Sibilance is when a singer is singing and sounds like S, T, and some other things like K and Ch, these sorts of consonants. That's the word that we use to describe them. So anytime she's got something like an S or a T or something like that, we're hearing, it's kind of like cutting my ears off at the moment. It's too much. So we're going to do something with EQ first, and then later we're going to do something else. I'll show you another way of dealing with the same issue. So where is it? Yeah, okay. Okay, let's stop it and have a listen again. I'm going to full screen this so you can see with full fidelity. Okay, we saw something here, and we saw something, oops, that's not the right kind. Not bandpass, what am I doing? Bell, that's it. So there's something here and something here, right? These two frequencies are a huge problem. I'm going to highlight these and turn them down and see what happens. This one need to be a little bit lower. A bit lower still. Cool. Okay. So we've got two. It's kind of like in two resonant frequencies that her sibilance is operating within, and what I've done is just turn those down. But we can't just turn it down in general because like if we turn this down, anything that's going to be on the left and right channel, like something that's panned all the way left and right, for example, like maybe some of the drums, are also going to have this processing applied to it. So let's have a listen to at what point in the stereo field her voice actually is. So is it on the left? Is it on the right? Is it in the middle? Or is it like kind of everywhere? Is it like really wide? Let's have a listen. It sounds, it's kind of everywhere, but I think the sibilance, to me, it sounds fairly central. Let's have a listen again. Yeah, so it sounds like actually, it's kind of, I think it's the reverb on her voice that is kind of like spreading her voice out a little bit. She might have like a little bit of a slapback kind of a delay also applied to it. Virtually all vocals have that applied to it in the mix. So yeah, I think that it's kind of spreading it out a little bit, but it's not spreading it out to the point where it's actually all the way over to the sides. So we can probably fix this if we only applied this processing to the very center of the stereo field. So how do we do that? We click this. And so this has got a bunch of different options for these bands. Actually, let's highlight them both so we can apply it to both. So we can choose to do it only on the sides. So now we've changed it so that these two points of attenuation are only being applied to the side channels, right? So only what's all the way over to the left and to the right. Or we can change it to mid. So these are only applying compression, this EQ attenuation of the sibilance frequencies of Chelsea Wolfe's voice to the center channel, the dead center. So this is something called mid-side processing. That's an important thing to know about because mid-side processing is kind of like, when you hear about like mastering kind of being like a dark art, no one knows how they're doing all these like magical things of like, picking and choosing where things are. And like, how did you turn that guitar that was on the left-hand side? How did you make that brighter for the guitar solo? It's mid-side processing. So we're only applying this processing to the middle. I won't go into how the EQ plugin actually does this. Just trust that it does. It's splitting it into a mid-side matrix and only applying it to the middle. Okay, so let's have a listen. This actually sounds really cool to me because actually now I'm hearing it so that her direct voice is less sibilant, but the reverberation of the S as it sort of tails off like that, it's much nicer and it goes out to the sides and it's a little bit brighter, but it's not so harsh because it's actually a reverb, so it's not so dynamic and and abrasive and stuff like that. Okay, so that's one thing we've done. Let's see if there's any questions about that. Cool. Okay. Again, please, any questions you have along the way, just ask because I want to make this as applicable to everyone as possible. Okay, so what's the next thing we have to do? So we have to keep in mind what we're mastering for at the moment. Right now, we're mastering for streaming. So this is a streaming master, and we have to keep in mind what streaming commands of us. Streaming is it's not needing so many particular parameters to be met for putting it onto a streaming platform as, for example, for cassette tape or for vinyl, especially like vinyl, like you can really mess up a vinyl master. You can make it so that the stylus like just jumps right off of the record if you don't master it correctly. But yeah, like this is streaming. Like streaming is just like, it's just digital. It's going to be a perfect replication of what you give it. I mean, it's not a perfect actually replication. I shouldn't say that because like, internet bandwidth isn't strong enough for streaming services to be like sending in lossless format. So it's actually like converting it to a lossier format. It might be like an MP3 or something. But yeah, it's like in terms of frequency response and stuff like that, we don't have to worry about it like just, crapping out on us. Okay, so let's have a listen to the whole thing. Or let's go to a different part of the song because that sounds pretty good to me. Let's see what happens when the drums kick in. Okay. Okay, I'm hearing a bit of a hi-hat coming in actually, and that hi-hat is a little bit off to the side, but it's also a little bit in the middle. So we're going to see what works best. It kind of sounds like I would like to hear it a little bit more sounding brighter on the sides, I think, because we can get a little bit of clarity out of it. So I'm doing this. I'm bringing this up, but notice here it says M. I'll make it bigger. So yeah, this says M. I don't know if it's translating well. I only want to apply this high shelf boost to the side channels. So I'm going to do this. So now it's attenuating the middle in these two frequencies, but it's actually turning up the high shelf on the side channel. But we don't want to do it too much. And notice as well how broad this curve is compared to our attenuations. When we're turning down, when you're attenuating, it's more transparent to have narrower shapes because it's more precise. It doesn't sound as affected. If you're boosting, especially in mastering, you want to have broader shapes. So you don't want to do something like this, for example. Like that's going to sound very much like you've just put an EQ on it and boosted up the highs. So I'm doing something quite gradual, quite gentle. Let's have a listen to it. So I'll bring it down and then I'll start bringing it up and see what happens. Okay. I'm going to put another one in. This one's going to be... Okay. I'm going to contradict myself right now because I've just done something that I said it's good not to do. But I boosted this up. I liked what it did. It brightened up the sides of the stereo field and made it sound wider, which I really like. But I wanted to hear the hi-hat a little bit more. And the hi-hat was actually so high frequency. It's almost like almost inaudible because it's such a high frequency hi-hat. But I'm hearing it still. And yeah, it was actually in this area. It was in the 18 kilohertz region. And I've just boosted only the hi-hat up and only in the sides. So you can hear it there. Let's undo that just for a sec and let's listen to what it sounds like without it. Now with it. So now that hi-hat is slightly stronger. We're doing very subtle changes here. We're trying to be as hands-off as possible while being sensitive to the intention of the artist and the producer and the mixing engineer. And yeah, we're applying only what we think was actually maybe overlooked. Okay, so we've got that. Now let's do something that we often do, which is a high-pass filter at around 100 hertz, only for the side channels. So what that does is it keeps the bass response mono. So it's dead center. Only the middle channel has bass frequencies, this one here. The sides have all of the bass cut out of it. Okay, we can actually even listen to what the bass sounds like in the side channels if we use this headphones icon. So you're hearing very stereo bass. If you don't have good headphones or good monitors to be listening on, this isn't going to be apparent to you. If you're using like small earbuds, it's not going to be apparent to you. But yeah, that's like some subsonic frequency content that's modulating side to side in the lowest frequency, in the lowest part of the frequency spectrum. So the reason why that's a problem is it actually doesn't do much. Yes, I can see comments. I think. I hope they heard my my response to their question. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So let's talk about low frequencies. So we're not very good at determining what direction a low frequency is coming from. Our brains aren't geared to be able to like decode that kind of sensory information. So what's happening here is we're having bass frequencies rising up on one side and then rising up on the other side and like kind of modulating side to side like that. And that isn't changing the way that we experience the music so much, because we still hear it more or less as if it's in the center. We can't really tell where it's coming from, especially people who don't have trained ears, especially like just general, music fans that aren't actually, involved in the creative process themselves or like involved in the mastering or mixing processes themselves. They're not going to have ears that are tuned to hear that anyway. People like us, we can hear it a little bit better, but still, like it's basically like it just sounds like it's in the middle, more or less. Like you might feel a little bit more pressure on one side or the other, but like you're not really knowing what's going on, what direction it's coming from. So we're getting rid of that content on the sides so that it's not going to eat up on our headroom in the last part of the mastering signal chain for streaming. So now that I've done this, let's have a listen to it and see what it sounds like. Let's turn it off. It sounds virtually the same to me. I can't tell the difference, and that's a good thing because it's transparent. It's so transparent that someone like me who has ears that are very tuned, like I can hear like the most minute change in an EQ. I can't hear the difference here right now. Like all I hear is it's just fine. It just sounds the same. But what it means is the next stage that we get to is going to be easier for us. So now that we've taken it out of the sides, we can actually just boost it up a little bit to give a little bit more low frequency content in the low mid range around the sides as well. So I'm just boosting up just before the cut. This is just a good general practice to do when you're doing this. You don't have to do it if you can't hear much of a difference. But generally, yeah, I just, as a rule, like if I cut bass, I want to do this because that kind of gives the impression you really have not cut any bass. Sounds good. I'm hearing the low end on the sides being quite tight and articulate, so I'm enjoying that. I think that's about it. Let's have a listen to what it sounds like at the end, see if there's any EQing issues that are happening here. Cool. It sounds pretty good to me. I've noticed that actually, like, we've already gotten to 1 p.m. This is definitely not going to be a 1 hour tutorial. If people need to go and like come back at some other point, that's totally fine. This is going to be available online in general, but you won't be able to ask questions during the stream and have them answered for you. So yeah, that's EQ pretty much done for me. If there's any questions you have about equalizing in the mastering process, please please write them down here. I'm actually going to go and take a bathroom break and come back, and I'm just going to ask you here as well. All right, let's see if there's any questions. None at all. Okay, no one has questions about EQ. Everyone's pretty clear. Okay, that's good for me. It means I explain things pretty accurately. Just, yeah, take note that actually all of these adjustments are so minute. Like, you know, plus or minus 2 decibels. Like, it's barely anything. We're just finessing it. We're not really going in there and hacking and slashing with an EQ, you know. Okay, so the next step of the chain is multi-band compression. By the way, you don't have to do all of these. You don't have to like go in and like do crazy amounts of stuff. You can do just as much as what you find is necessary. But yeah, I'm going to use multi-band compression here just to demonstrate what you can do with it. So we're going to go to, again, the loudest part of the song so that we can hear all the different, the most harmonically complex part of the song, basically, and the most dynamic part. And we're going to be able to hear and see on the spectrum what are the important areas. And I'm just going to go click in different bands for the multi-band compressor. So here we have the sub-frequencies. We can see it all here. Now here we can see low mids right there. There's barely anything there. There's some here. Definitely a lot there. Okay, so we've got 4 different bands. Those are the important ones that I found. You might, find something different. You might think that, something else might happen. But those were the places that had most of the dynamic content. So this is basically a multi-band compressor as opposed to a broadband compressor, which was the first thing that we applied. So this is another stage of compression that is going to be specific to frequency regions along the spectrum. Okay, so sometimes I'm hearing that the bass frequencies are jumping out a bit too much, so let's see what we can do about that. can solo it. This is the low mid-range stuff. That's the subs. That's the bass. I'm gonna bring the threshold down a little bit. Cool. I might actually bring this one a bit. It doesn't need to be so compressed. This, however, I think needs a little bit. And this as well. This is like this is gonna sound really harsh if I solo it, but I'll do it just for a second just to give you an example of what's actually happening up there. It's just this hissing, airy sound. Yeah, there we go. Because again, it's like every time she breathes even, it's like there's so much of that high frequency stuff coming out, and that's a character of her voice that we need to preserve. But we also don't want it to like cut off people's ears. You know, it's like we don't want it to be like feeling like too shrill. So that's something that we can do to affect that. That sounds pretty good to me. The next thing we do is just like the broadband compressor, we open up the sidechain and we unlink the stereo. So now all of these effectively two different we got two different compressors, multiband compressors, one for the left channel and one for the right channel, and they're going to be responding according to their own information. So let's go a bit forward. Sounds good to me now. Okay. Let's move on. Is there any questions about multiband compression? No? Okay. Let's go on to saturation. I'm going to use Saturn. So this is actually a multiband saturator. And why do we use saturation? Basically, if you listen to a master that's done in like a really, really fancy mastering studio, they're putting your song through a signal chain that has a bunch of different like processing units, compressors, EQs. They all actually impart their own saturation to your sound, as well as doing their primary function, which is the processing, of whatever it's supposed to do, like, compression or EQ or whatever it might be. So we're basically mimicking that now in digital. So we're pretending like all of the processes we just put it through are actually like really nice high-end, like hardware compressors, multiband compressors, EQs, stuff like that. But the difference is this is a multi-band saturator, and I'm going to show you what that means by demonstrating how it works in a broadband mode, which is what it is now. It's just one single, it's the entire frequency spectrum that's about to be saturated. Let's have a listen to that. I'm going to use old tape setting. Here we can hear distortion. Listen to the interaction of the lower frequencies with the higher frequencies. Like every time the bass of the bass drum or whatever it is, it's like toms or something, hits, like it's like imparting harmonic artifacts on the vocals. Let's have a listen. So obviously that's bad, and obviously I've put in like, an extreme setting just to show you, what this is actually doing. We're only doing like a touch of this. So let's do the same setting and actually split it up into a bunch of different bands according to where those areas look like they are. So here. And now we have 5 different bands, and they all have the exact same level of overdrive, of saturation applied to them. Exact same level as when we had it in broadband mode. So this is actually quite distorted, but it doesn't sound very distorted. And that's because we've split it up into a bunch of different bands and they're all distorting individually instead of having every single element interacting with every other element, if that makes sense. Still, I'm not a fan of this old tape setting. I'm going to use a clean tube, and I'm going to turn this all the way down. I've highlighted every single one of these so that it's applying it equally to every single one, and we're going to have a listen to what it does. Every time I do a process like this, I'm starting from 0, taking it up to when it's just a touch too far, bringing it back down again, and then finding the sweet spot, you know? So that's what I've just done. This is where it sounds good to me. It doesn't sound too distorted. And we're on the most harmonically complex and most dynamically complex part of the song so that we can really hear what it's doing when it's like the most, most aggressive. So this is mimicking a tube, like a vacuum tube, like a preamp, like a tube preamp from maybe the 1960s or something like that, but a very, very high quality one that's not going to impart too many nasty harmonic artifacts onto the sound. Okay, that sounds really good to me as well. So let's move on. Actually, no, let's not move on. So we have to put this into HQ mode. HQ mode actually is something that gets rid of a specific kind of distortion that's like unique to digital. It's something called aliasing distortion, and it's something that when we're mastering in digital, we always are looking out for and thinking about. Because, basically it's like, when you're applying distortion to something, it's changing it's adding harmonics. It's like generating harmonics, and it's diminishing the dynamic range at the same time. And some of those harmonics might actually be too high frequency for the sample rate to be able to reproduce. So it ends up reflecting back into the spectrum. It's one of the bizarre artifacts of digital. So that's what I've done. HQ, it gets rid of that. It's a processing that's more CPU intensive, but it's getting rid of this digital form of distortion, which is not a musical form of distortion, so to speak. It's not like imparting harmonics according to the harmonic sequence, which is something that we're naturally used to because every pitched sound is obeying the harmonic sequence. But instead, it's like, it's getting rid of the ones that are like going back into the spectrum in a weird way. Okay, so we've done that. And the last thing that we should do is the limiter. So here's where things get really important for streaming. So let's see if there's any questions about saturation. So I'm just going to keep going. Limiting is a form of compression. It's a form of broadband compression, just like the first process that we put it through. What we're doing with a limiter is we're setting it to a specific setting so that it doesn't exceed a certain volume, so that it doesn't move past a point that we set it at. I don't know if I should explain every single detail of this, but I'll tell you exactly what to do for streaming. And if you obey these guidelines, you're going to do great. It's going to sound perfect. It's going to sound exactly how you have done every other part of the processing and production and mixing and all that when it's put onto Spotify or Apple Music or any of those sort of things. So 2 things we need to be paying attention to is a metering style called LUFS. LUFS, otherwise known as LUFS, is a unit of measuring loudness. It stands for loudness units full scale. So just like we had decibels full scale, we now have loudness units full scale. This is a fairly recent thing for music. Metering has always been an evolving. It's always changing, like how we meter things, how we consider things. In like the in the 40s and 50s, it would have been VU meters. Eventually, you get things like RMS meters, you get things like DBFS meters, like what we were looking at before for checking the headroom. Now we're using LUFS meters because this is the new normal. This is the new standard for measuring loudness and homogenizing it across the global musical and broadcasting landscape. It was decided by the European Broadcasting Union, and it was either 2010 and 2014 when this was. I think they changed something in 2014, and I'm not sure exactly what it was, but this one is according to the most recent one. So this is the 2004 normal, and we're using that LUFS that's calibrated to that 2014 normal. I think I said 2004. 2014 is what I meant to say. We're using that LUFS that's calibrated to that 2014 normal, and we're going to be getting the exact LUFS reading that Spotify, for example, is looking for when we send it to them. Because the thing about streaming platforms is when you give them a master, if it's louder than negative 14 LUFS as of 29th of March 2020, it's going to turn it down to negative 14. If it's, for example, like if you send them a master that's negative 9 LUFS, it's going to turn it down to negative 14. And when you're up at negative 9, you're probably actually limiting the dynamic range quite a lot. You're compromising the dynamic range of the music. So you're imparting something that doesn't need to be there. You're like there's no longer any positive in terms of like on streaming platforms. There's no longer any positive to over compressing your master. So I mean, like we've already gone through like a bunch of compression, but like this is actually nothing compared to the sheer degree of compression that was being put onto tracks in, like, for example, like 2002. Like if you listen to any album from that era, like it's just obscene. Like it was a huge problem. And also like watching television, this was actually the reason why LUFS was created. Watching television, you would have a program and you would be watching the program and then the advertisement would come in and it'd be like 5 times louder than the program. And it's because they've been like pummeling it with compression. And they're making it so that it's louder than the program, so it can like just grab your attention and like just violently shake you to like buy their terrible product or whatever. So so LUFS is the standardized metering system now, and negative 14 is what we use for streaming. So I'm using FabFilter Pro L2. I've turned on loudness here. So these are all these different metering styles. We want loudness. Loudness is LUFS. Here, I've set it to negative 14, which it already is set to for streaming. There's also LUFS for CD. So it's just changing the zoom on all of this stuff. So you can master it for CD as well. But negative 14 is the streaming level. So what we're going to do is, and also one other thing, I've set this to integrated. Integrated is what Spotify is looking at. So this is just telling us what this large meter is going to be doing when we are hearing the limiter doing its work. And integrated is how it's actually analyzing the information going in. So again, just follow this. If you don't understand it, it's okay. Just follow all of these steps. So you're setting it to loudness, which is LUFS. You're setting this to integrated. So you can see this big number here telling you what the actual number is that Spotify is going to be looking at. And here you'll have -14 streaming. So that's your that's what you're using to like calibrate your limiter. Okay, let's have a listen, and what we're going to do is start bringing up the gain until we see -14 here. So we got still quite a lot to go. Pay attention to the big meter in these ones. So now we're at -15.8. That's okay, it's not ideal. The reason why it's not ideal is because it's underneath -14 LUFS, and what that means is that once you send it to Spotify, it's just going to say, okay, that's the volume it's at. That's fine. It's not going to turn it up to -14. It'll only ever turn something that's too loud down to -14. So that's something very, very important to pay attention to. So it's never turning your quieter signal up. It's only turning your too loud signal down. So we can still put in, I don't know, let's put it up to 7 or something. Let's see what that does. Amazing. We've got -13.5 integrated LUFS. Spotify is going to look at that and say, oh, okay, I need to turn it down by 0.5 LUFS. That's fine. That's going to sound exactly the same volume as if we turned this up to an obscene level and had it like crunching away on the limiter. Because Spotify is going to turn that down to -14. Okay, so that's how streaming works. Let's see if there's any questions about that. No questions. I'm surprised. Maybe no one's watching anymore. I wonder. No, there's 6 viewers. Okay. All right. Yeah, so that's what we're doing. And actually, something to note. Did you notice that there was at no point any actual limiting that was applied to that? So I'll just play that again, and I'm going to turn it up. So at the moment, it's at +7 gain. So we've turned up the input of the limiter to +7, and that's given us the correct meter reading, which is great. The limiter itself is not doing anything right now. It's doing absolutely nothing. It's not touched what we've done to every other part of the signal processing chain. This, if you said that to someone that was a mastering engineer in 2002, would be like a godsend, because they were under so much pressure to turn it up and up and up and make these limiters sound more and more transparent, but it's always just a losing battle because it's literally destroying the dynamic range of your mix, of your master or whatever. Okay, there's something actually I forgot to mention. True peak limiting, this control down here. If you have that off, it's not green. If you have that on, it's green. That's extremely important because also it's one of the other elements that streaming platforms look at. True peak limiting is different to peak limiting in that peak limiting is looking at your sample. Like, let me just show you this real quick. So if we go here and we zoom in, I'm zooming right into this. Eventually you see these dots. Each of these dots is one sample that's exactly the distance apart according to the sample rate. So this is 48 kilohertz, 24-bit. So each sample is basically 1 second divided by 48,000. So that's how many samples we've got it cut up into. And the limiter is looking at that. What it's not looking at is something called intersample peaks. Sometimes it's not super important, but like basically sometimes you might have like um, a limiter that's like limiting, the actual like samples to say like negative 0.1 decibels full scale. But there's intersample peaks that are peaking up into like plus 3 decibels full scale. That's a problem for streaming services for some reason that I don't really understand why, but they all want you to do true peak limiting, which doesn't actually change the sound of the limiter, but it changes the way that their algorithm identifies it. And then we need to actually have this true peak limiting output setting to -1. So -1 decibel TP is -1 decibel true peak. So now we've set it to, if there's ever any like random intersample peak, which we can't even hear, that just jumps out, that the Spotify algorithm or the Apple Music algorithm is, responding to, it's not going to turn it down to a quieter LUFS reading. I hope that's all clear. I feel like, I've never spoken about this stuff out loud to people. So I'm realizing just how technical and like how geeky this shit is. Like, I hope that people are still like enjoying listening to this. But yeah, so we've basically just made a streaming master. And yeah, I wanted to give you an example of what the difference is between a streaming master and a CD master. Because this is a streaming master. We've got negative 13.5 LUFS, as long as it's around negative 14. And it's, just a touch above negative 14 is good. You don't want it to be under negative 14 because it's not going to be turning it up. But yeah, regardless, it's like the dynamic range is perfectly intact. So let's show you what it sounds like if we put it to -9, which is what the standard is for CD. And I'll show you what happens. And yeah, just keep in mind, this is going to get considerably louder. So let's turn this off. Okay, so now we have created a limiting setting that is what the standard is for CD. Notice that it was compressing quite a lot. Hang on, I'll show you what happens if we freeze it. Okay, so we can see here all of those red spikes that are spiking down. That is the limiter turning the signal down. So, and that icy looking grayish blue, see how the top is just flat? That means that all of the loudest dynamics have been sliced off. So I'm not a fan of this. To me, this is a really harsh imposition on the integrity of the art that is being created, because it's just destroying. It's not doing anything to enhance it. It's only destroying. Like at the end of the day, the listener, if it's too quiet, they're going to turn it up. It's not like that big a deal. We just need to get it to a nominal level that's going to be fine, and they can turn it up. However, bands often are quite convinced that it has to be a certain level. So, if it's not going to be the same level as their favorite album, which happens to have been produced in 2002, then they're not going to be happy about it. And it doesn't matter how much of this nerdy stuff you talk about with them. From my experience, they don't listen. They don't listen to that. So yeah, you're probably going to have to do this compromise, and eventually there'll be a generation that doesn't give a fuck about this shit. Okay, so that's the difference. So -7. So no, +7. +7 for streaming master. So we've done a streaming master now. All right, let's talk. Let's see if there's no questions. Okay, let's talk about cassette tape mastering. All right, so cassette tapes are considerably different to streaming. First of all, it's a physical medium. It's your, I mean, the way the cassette tapes work is like it's a piece of plastic tape that has some kind of a material on it that can be magnetized so that it is representing the waveform of the music that you're wanting to reproduce. So this shape is the direction in which the magnetized particles are going to be going on the piece of plastic tape itself. So there's two types of tapes that you really need to know about, type 1 and type 2. Okay, so those are the standard names of them, and they have different properties that make them up. So type 1 is a tape that has material on it that's the magnetic particles. It's ferric oxide, that's what they use. So that's type 1. Type 2 uses chromium dioxide. It's you don't really need to know the difference of the names and all these sort of things, but you do need to know the difference in how you master for it. They're quite different. So basically, type 1 ferric tape is like the shortened name for type 1. Type 1 has a higher signal to noise ratio, so tape, you're always going to have some hiss. So type 1 tape has more hiss than type 2 tape. However, if you think about like the retro vintage sound, that's the sound everyone's talking about. The type 1 ferric oxide tape is what everyone's talking about. It has a louder bass response and it has a quieter treble response. Okay, so when you're mastering, you actually want to master a little bit brighter than you would normally want it to be. And it's actually good if you also have a decent tape deck on hand and a clean type 1 tape cassette, so you can actually just bounce it out and just have a listen to what it actually sounds like once you've put it to tape. Because so long as you've got everything calibrated correctly on your tape deck, it's going to reproduce it the way it will on, more or less the way it will on a professional tape manufacturing tape deck. So that's the difference. So let's look at what that means. So in terms of limiting, you don't actually need to do that. In terms of saturation, you don't need to do that either, because actually the tape itself is what we were mimicking here, like the effect of tape saturation, or in this case we were using tube saturation, but they're fairly similar. So tape distorts. Multiband compression we leave on, EQ we leave on, compressor we leave on. You can actually be a little bit more aggressive with your compression. You can turn the threshold down, and you can you can still use a limiter, but not actually use it as a limiter, but just use it as something to boost up the gain of the signal, so that it's like like the tape manufacturer has like a input sensitivity that they're going to actually be manipulating until they get the cleanest sound. But the thing is, we need to have enough compression so that it's the quietest parts of the song are loud enough to be above the noise floor of the cassette tape. So say, for example, the start of this song, as we have it now, it's very quiet. If there was some hiss going on, this would be a problem. So let me give you an example. I'm just going to bring in a hiss track. I'm going to use a pink noise generator. So if this is the level of the noise in the tape, that's kind of unacceptable for this song, because if it starts like this, you're hearing a lot more noise than you're hearing actual signal, because the signal to noise ratio is pretty bad. So what we need to do is we need to turn up the compression. So we need to drop the threshold down and see what happens, and then turn up the wet gain. Oh, whoops, I have to turn this on again. Right, so now we're hearing it louder. You might want to use a stricter threshold, maybe 4:1. Cool. Okay. Now you basically, you know, like you can hear the noise, and that's just going to happen with tape. You're going to hear noise, but this is something that we're doing to make it so that it doesn't have too bad of a signal to noise ratio in its reproduction, so that the actual signal of your song is going to be translating and not being masked by the noise of the tape itself. So that's what you would do for both type 1 and type 2 tapes. Type 1, you would also probably put in a high shelf like this that is for stereo. So it's all of it. So it's turning it up for all of it. So this is going to be... So this is too loud. It's too bright for me. It's a bit shrill to me. But once you transfer it onto the tape, it's going to sound pretty good. Another thing you want to do with tape is actually put a high pass filter in both the mids and the sides. And for the mids, you can just have it at around 40 hertz or something like that. What that's going to do is it's going to make it so that they can put a little bit more signal in, a little bit more volume into the tape itself, so that it's got a better signal to noise ratio. We're compromising by losing a little bit of this low end. So unfortunately, it's one of the compromises we have to make if we want it to be audible above the noise floor of the tape. So that's what you would do for type 1. And type 2, which is the chromium dioxide tape, also known as chrome tape, we do the exact opposite. So we turn this down. So we want to attenuate the high frequencies, because actually chromium dioxide tape has a brighter frequency response and less bass response. And so we're turning down the high frequencies and we're turning up the bass wherever it sounds good to you. Cool? So something like this. That sounds pretty dull right now. Doesn't sound very exciting to listen to. Also, this is clipping all of a sudden. I wonder why. Is it the compressor? Oh yeah, the compressor. Let's put this back to 0. Sorry, I forgot I'd done all that. You don't want this meter to go red here. That's a problem. 2:1. What do we have? 3 decibels. Yeah, it's about that. Okay. Cool. All right. So that's mastering for tape. Is there any questions about mastering for tape? Actually, something I forgot to mention about streaming. Once we'd finished all this processing that we did to it, let's get rid of this, get rid of this, and get rid of this one. So this is what we had it for streaming, and we had this on and this on as well. I can't remember. I did something that has now changed the levels that we have in the limiter, but that doesn't matter. So let's pretend let's just go back in time. Let's pretend we had everything set the way that we wanted to. What you actually have to do then is render it. So you go Control-Alt-R, you browse for a directory. Let's just say desktop, whatever. And we're actually going to need to change the, depending on the streaming service, you're going to have to actually change the sample rate and the bit depth. So for example, like if you're sending it to Spotify, you would go 44.1 or 44100, still wave, but you want 16-bit. And you need to dither the master. Dithering, this tiny little option here, you need to turn that on. Dithering is something that's necessary for when you drop down in bit rate. Bit rate is like what fidelity the dynamics of a mix are. So, like for example, like in the quieter part of the song, how many steps of volume differences can it be, right? If you go from 24-bit, which is quite high fidelity, to 16-bit, it's much less in 16-bit, and that means that the quietest part of your dynamic might just immediately cut off. And so a dither is an introduction of a very tiny amount of noise, like a very slight amount of white noise that's just louder than the lowest bit. So that as soon as your volume of your mix drops below that lowest bit, it doesn't just drop into silence suddenly, like it's not this step down into silence. It's actually getting absorbed into the noise floor. So it's introducing a tiny amount of noise. And then you render, and yeah, you've got it. Always listen back to your renders because it's going to actually, sometimes you might actually find that there's a glitch and you might have to render it again. So always listen back and always listen to if there's any clicks, pops, anything like that. Okay, so we've done that. We've done mastering for tape. So mastering for tape, exactly the same thing, except you don't really have to change the sample rate or bit depth because whoever's doing your tape duplication, the tape doesn't care about what the sample rate and bit depth of your master is. And it's better not to add noise. It's better not to add dithering because the tape already has noise. And the tape is like it doesn't really, it's an analog format. You know, you just put it in and you calibrate the tape machine right. You get your mastering, right. You put the right levels in for the sensitivity and it's going to be fine. Okay, let's talk about vinyl. If there's any questions for tape, no. Let's talk about vinyl. So vinyl records have made quite a resurgence. When we're mastering for vinyl, there's a few things that we have to think about. There's a few limitations. For example, the biggest limitation for vinyl is is the way that it reproduces bass frequencies and high frequencies. So the two key things to consider when mastering for vinyl is what is happening in the low mid-range and below frequency range in the sides of your headphones. So here we have the sides cut out from 100 hertz, but this isn't going to cut it for vinyl. This can still, especially with a song like this that's got like quite a lot of bass content, this can make the stylus jump right off of the record itself if this is cut to a vinyl. Okay, so we need to actually bring this right up to about 300, between 2 and 300 hertz. Okay, that's a lot. So the side channels don't actually have any bass in it at all. It's only got like mid-range and above. All of the bass is mono. It's only down the middle. Okay, so this is something that's going to make it so that the stylus can move freely around the vinyl. It's not going to be a problem anymore. However, there's one other problem, which is high frequencies. Okay, so if you have high frequencies that are too dynamic, this is a song that's actually quite a good example of high frequencies that are too dynamic, that we've had to attenuate a little bit for your streaming master and CD master. for vinyl, I'm going to have to do even more, except I'm going to do it in a different way because I think that Chelsea Wolfe would have wanted it to be quite, breathy and bright, but I think it's just the S's and T's. So it would be in these two. We would go through and have a listen. So that S that we heard, that's definitely not going to do it. There we go. So I've just brought down the threshold of this highest band so that it's just, when she's singing, you can see the level is just underneath the threshold itself. And as soon as a S or a T comes in, it's immediately turning it down. And I'm actually going to turn the ratio up to infinity to 1, which is limiting. So we're limiting the high frequencies here. There we go. Amazing. Now this is going to be something that actually works very well for vinyl. If you feel like after having done this, taking out the bass out of the sides, it sounds too thin when we get into the louder section, like here. Which I definitely think it sounds a bit too thin. It's not having that pounding effect. It'd be good to go in and add a little bit of bass, but you don't want to add sub bass because sub bass frequencies are so slow and so high energy. It's another thing that can make the stylus jump off the record. So instead, we're going to turn it up in the bass region. I'm doing about 140 hertz. Let's see. Cool. So then I would go through and have a listen to it. Make sure that the limiter is actually not turned, is not boosting any gain. You can have it on just in case it's gonna clip. But this is another thing. The vinyl, whoever's cutting the lacquer. So when you send a master to a vinyl manufacturer, they're going to listen to it. They're actually going to pay very close attention to everything that I'm telling you about right now, because they are wanting to have a certain quality of product. If they hear that there's too much bass frequency response, they're going to go in and start cutting it, and they're not in communication with the artist. They're not in communication with the producer or the mixing engineer or any of the people that are involved in the creative process. They are just going to do it however they consider is the right way to do it, which might not be the way that the artists themselves wanted to do. Okay, so that's why we're doing it here. But the vinyl cutter is going to listen to it and they're going to adjust it accordingly as well. So we want them to not do that because we're part of the creative process and they're part of the printing. They're part of the production of the physical product, of the commodity itself, right? So that's why we're doing all of this. So they're going to apply their own processing if they see that it's not working. And we don't want them to do that, basically. Okay, so it doesn't matter how loud it is, so long as it's it's not up and clipping. Don't limit it. A vinyl master doesn't need to be limited. It's going to make it sound worse. It's actually going to make it sound quieter a lot of the time in vinyl pressing. Vinyl pressing is like very counterintuitive for people that are people like me who are digital minded, because actually, like, the more you compress it, the quieter it sounds, and the less information that they can actually put onto the disc itself. And something else, you want to pay attention to the side lengths and pay attention to what size vinyl and what the RPM of the vinyl is, and how, like, because that determines like how long each side can be, and you don't want to get too close to the limit of how long it can be, because while that's, like, digital minded people like us think of limits as hard limits, it's not a hard limit. It's like that's the absolute, like, extent at where you can get to, and you don't even want to get close to it, really. Like, if for example, if it's like 33 minutes, this manufacturer says, you want to be around 28 minutes, because that actually, like, each groove, each track of grooves that's going into the vinyl. You want them to be far enough away so that there's enough dynamics between them so that it can really reproduce what you want it to reproduce. So when you're working with analog formats like this, you're always having to keep in mind the medium itself. So that's where mastering is important. We're the ones that are interfacing with the creatives, the musicians, producers, and the medium itself, the actual physical commodity. Okay. Lastly, I want to talk about any questions for vinyl. Yeah, please. If you have questions about anything, just ask, because there's been no chats, even though there's still people watching. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is CD masters. So CD masters, exactly the same as streaming. Only difference is you might go a little bit more aggressive with the limiter. I would recommend having a conversation if you're doing your own stuff and you're mastering for CD. That's fine. You can make up your own mind. Do you want to compromise the integrity of the signal and sound volume-wise comparable to a 2002 record? Or do you want to not compare yourself to the early 2000s and have it sound good but be at a quieter volume with all of the integrity of all of the necessary processes of mastering, and have the control of the volume not up to you, the masterer, but up to the audience. So the audience has control of the volume knob. If the master is too loud, they'll turn it down, and that's that. So that's a choice you can make yourself. But if you're working with a band, you're probably going to have to ask the band what their opinion is. Just briefly, try not to use too technical terms. Talk about this whole thing and see what they say. Obviously, we all have our biases and stuff. And the way I talk about it, it's really obvious that the wrong thing to do is to continue with this fucking 2002 trend, But yeah, it's a thing that you should consider. So when we're mastering for CD, that's basically the difference between streaming and CD. You want it to, represent what the artist wants, but you don't want to go above -9 LUFS, loudness units full scale. That's 2002. That's too loud. Anyway, I think that's it. No, actually, that's not it. Let's talk about, okay, let's do this. I'm going to get this up to whatever level it needs to be for -9 CD. Let's pretend the artist wants us to do 2002 level mastering. Okay, we've got it. So now, oh yeah, and we can also turn on oversampling now. Because we're actually using the limiter, it's actually limiting. We can turn on oversampling. So this is going to be, it doesn't really matter what you turn it on to. ×2 is already doing what we need it to do, so you can just put on oversampling. Oversampling is the same as HQ mode in Saturn. It's getting rid of that digital kind of distortion, okay? So now let's pretend we've finished this and we're rendering it. And browse for directory, let's go on the desktop, and we're gonna go 44.1, we're gonna go 16-bit, we're gonna turn on dither, and we're going to render this entire project. So this is going to do its thing for a while. Hopefully it's not going to You can see as soon as the drums kick in, it's already just Okay, that's finished. And so I'm going to save this and close it. And usually what happens next is we go into a different program. We're going to open up this one, Hofer CD Burn DDP Master. So when we are creating a master for a CD, one of our jobs as mastering engineers is to apply our metadata into the CD. So what we've just done is like we've rendered this to a stereo master. We can just drag and drop into here. So now it's in there. I can zoom in. So now we can see down here, this is a different program. Again, 1377x.to if you need that. So it's here. This is exactly what we just did and rendered. I'm going to get rid of this tooltips. However, it's just sound. And if the band, especially, you know, if they're like going down like the real like music business kind of like path, they might have like certain expectations of what is going to be in the metadata of this track, of this single. So here we've got a bunch of information that we can put in. Okay, so it's already automatically filled in a bunch of stuff, right? So track number 1, index, start, you know, CD time 0, duration 3 minutes 34 seconds, 160 milliseconds, whatever. Often a group will need an ISRC code. This is a unique code that's applied to each track. It's like a copyright thing. So let's just say Chelsea Wolf 0001, whatever. So this is like if you're curious about that, just Google ISRC codes and like if you ever get like a distributor. Ooh, yeah, of course it's not. I just made it up. So yeah, obviously you need to like get a real ISRC code. You can't just make it up. Track title, you know, what is it? Air Day. Album title, blah, 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 blah. Track artist, you know, Chelsea Wolf, whatever. So once you do that, you can write DDP. It's this here. You can see write DDP. This is the kind of file that you need to give to a CD pressing plant for them to press the CD. What they're going to do is they're going to use that DDP file, which has all of your audio information and all of your metadata and all of the track lengths, times, when things start. If there's like, you know, any like weird stuff like secret tracks you want to put in and stuff like that, you can do that in this as well. And they're going to use that file to create a DDP image CD, which is then going to be the template that's used for creating the master disk that is then going to be like physically pressing onto each CD. So it's not like burning, you know, like they're pressing it, you know. So that's the last thing you need to do. This is Hofer CD Burn DDP Master. Yeah, you can buy it from Hofer, or if you don't have the means, you can do other things as well, I'm sure. Okay, we're done. That's how you master stuff. Is there any questions? Apparently we've got some viewers, but like everyone's being very quiet. Don't be shy if you're still there, if it's not just a background thing that you're listening to. But yeah, I'm going to close this, and I'm not going to... Don't need any changes. Thank you. Thank you. Cool. Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in. It's, yeah, it's really nice. I'm glad that I can help. If any of you have any questions, you can email us or message our Facebook. I'm also in lockdown. We're all in lockdown. So if you have any questions, you can just like, you can just send it to us, and like, we'll just like, I'll just respond, you know, it's not a problem. Like, we're all incredibly bored. We're all like locked in our houses, so yeah. Hope you're all staying healthy and doing all the things that you need to do. Yeah, as always, love and solidarity from Push Buttons crew. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Maybe we'll do another one soon.